Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, let's dive into a piece of American history that you might not know about. A story about land, legacy, and the fight for justice. We're heading to New Mexico. The story of Reies López Tijerina, a fascinating guy.
And our deep dive is using an episode transcript from the Mr. Hutchings History podcast. It's a really good overview of this whole thing.
Yeah, for sure. But this isn't just a boring history lesson, you know? This is about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed back in 1848. It promised land rights for Mexican citizens after the Mexican-American War, but, well, those promises kind of got broken, and that's what sparked a whole movement, with Tijerina at the helm trying to reclaim what was lost. Have you ever thought about, how a treaty signed so long ago could still be impacting things today? Because that's exactly what we're talking about here.
It really is interesting how this treaty, which was meant to end a war, actually, in a way, created a new conflict that lasted for generations. I mean, think about it. Huge amounts of land, California, Arizona, New Mexico, even parts of Texas, all changed hands. And Article 8 of the treaty, it was supposed to protect the property rights of all the Mexican citizens already living in those territories. But, well, it didn't really work out that way.
Almost like what do they call it? A bait and switch, right? The treaty said one thing, but then U.S. courts, especially the ones using English common law instead of the Spanish legal traditions, they started figuring out ways to, invalidate the Mexican land grants. And then on top of that, you had straight up fraud and sometimes just taking the land by force.
Exactly. And that's where Tijerina comes in. He was born in 1926, right in the middle of all this. By the 1960s, he had become, well, a pretty powerful preacher. And he was able to tap into all this anger and frustration people had and turn it into a real movement.
So he wasn't just, a lawyer in a suit filing paperwork. He actually founded the Alianza Federal de las Mercedes, which is the Federal Alliance of Land Grants, in 1963. And their tactics, they were definitely not passive.
Oh, yeah. He was amazing at giving speeches, captivating. And his words resonated with people who felt like the system had betrayed them. But the Alianza was about more than just words. They used legal challenges, organized protests, even occupied land they believed was rightfully theirs. It was a strategy with multiple angles to it.
And it definitely shook things up. There are two big events that stand out. In 1966, they tried to occupy part of the Kit Carson National Forest. That led to arrests and really ramped up the tension. And then in 1967, things came to a head with the Arriba County courthouse raid.
Yeah, that raid on June 5th, 1967, that was a turning point for sure. Tijerina led a group of armed men to the courthouse in Tierra Amarilla. Their goal was to free some Alianza members who had been jailed, but they also wanted to, send a message against the legal system they saw as corrupt.
And this wasn't just symbolic either. 2 officers got hurt during the raid, and they actually took over the courthouse for a bit. The whole country was watching, and people had really strong opinions on both sides. Some people saw Tijerina as a hero, others as a dangerous radical.
It really made people ask the question, how far is too far when you're fighting for something you believe in? Especially when you're talking about generations of injustice.
Right, and you can't forget, this wasn't happening in a vacuum. The 1960s were, a time of huge social change. You had the civil rights movement going on, challenging segregation and inequality all over the U.S.
And Tijerina, he made those connections very clear. He sought his movement, the fight for land in New Mexico, as part of the larger fight for social justice that was happening everywhere. But there were some key differences, too. You see, a lot of the civil rights movement, like the main parts we all know about, they were really big on nonviolent resistance. But Tijerina, he wasn't afraid to use force. And, that made some folks uneasy.
Yeah, that's a big difference, right? Does that make you think, did Tijerina using those more, aggressive tactics, did it actually help his cause or did it hurt it? I mean, it definitely made people pay attention, but did it push away people who might have supported him? What do you think about that?
Well, historians are still debating that today. Some people say that being willing to fight back, even take up arms, that it was the only way to get this system to wake up and listen. They point out that peaceful protests, they had been going on for decades, and nobody was doing anything about it.
It's kind of like sometimes you got to yell to be heard, but then there's the other side of it too.
Right, exactly. There are other historians who say that those tactics, especially at that courthouse raid, it made a lot of people turn against him. It made it harder for him to get people on his side about land reform. They say it just reinforced those old stereotypes about Mexican Americans, the ones about them being violent and lawless.
So it's like a double-edged sword then. But no matter how you see those tactics, one thing's for sure. Tijerina's story shows us that history is messy. It's complicated.
Yeah, rarely are there easy answers.
Yeah.
And to really understand Tijerina, we got to look deeper than just the headlines. We got to get into the different ways people see his legacy, you know? I mean, think about it. His own writings, his speeches, they're all filled with these passionate arguments about land rights, all going back to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. He truly believed he was in a legal fight, a moral fight, not just a political one.
And then you've got the government records, court documents, police reports from the raid, all that. Those show a different side. They focus on how what he did was against the law, how he was a threat to, keeping things peaceful.
Oh, and we can't leave out the media. The newspapers and TV at the time, they often, well, they made things more dramatic, Sometimes they made Tijerina out to be this folk hero, and other times he was like a dangerous radical.
It's like everyone had their own version of what happened, all shaped by their own biases and what they wanted people to believe. No wonder people still argue about it so much. But even with all that controversy, one thing's clear. What Tijerina did, it had a ripple effect, and it went way beyond New Mexico. He became a symbol of resistance for a whole new generation of Chicano activists.
His fight for land rights, it became part of this bigger thing, the Chicano movement of the 60s and 70s. That movement, it was about reclaiming their culture, fighting for more power in politics, and really challenging discrimination across the board.
So even though the Alianza, Tijerina's group, even though they didn't hit all their goals when it came to changing land laws, they still had a big impact. They helped start a movement for social change that we're still seeing today. It's almost like Tijerina planted a seed, and that seed grew into something way bigger than him.
Exactly right. And I think that might be one of the biggest things we can learn from Tijerina's story. Sometimes, even when movements don't get everything they want right away, they can still make a huge difference just by inspiring other people to keep fighting.
It makes you think, right? Like, what are we fighting for today? What are the things that maybe won't change overnight, but could be setting the stage for change down the road? It's something to think about.
It really is, and it leads us to a really important question. What does Tijerina's legacy mean for us today? Like, how do we deal with the issues of land rights and broken treaties and the whole system being stacked against some people, Those are the things he was fighting against.
Because let's face it, those problems haven't gone away. They're still here, not just in the Southwest, but all over the world, really. And what we learned from Tijerina, from his wins and his losses, it gives us some important things to consider, especially if we're fighting for justice ourselves.
Absolutely. One of the most important things I think we can take away is this. If you want to make real change, you probably need to use a few different strategies. Legal stuff, campaigns to raise awareness, getting people organized on a local level, and sometimes even doing things directly, taking action yourself.
I feel like you need a whole toolbox, right?
Yeah.
Different tools for different jobs, and you got to be ready to change how you're doing things depending on the situation.
You got it. And another really important lesson is about understanding history. Not just as a bunch of names and dates, but as something that's still happening, something that shapes what's going on today. What Tijerina did, it reminds us that the past isn't really over. It's still with us. It shapes what's happening now and what'll happen in the future.
And that we can learn from the good stuff and the mistakes that people made before us. Their struggles can be inspiring and their challenges can teach us stuff. And their stories, they can give us the power to create a world that's more just and fair for everybody.
Very well said. And speaking of stories, there's one more part of Tijerina's legacy I think we should talk about. See, Tijerina wasn't just some political guy. He was really spiritual, too. He saw that whole fight for land. He saw it as connected to like a bigger fight for his culture to survive, to keep a way of life that was, all about the land itself.
So it was deeper than just laws and money, right? It was about something more, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. For Tijerina and for a lot of his followers, too, the land was like sacred. It was tied to their history, their whole identity, who they were deep down. If you took them away from that land, it was like taking away part of themselves.
It makes me think about how we usually talk about land like it's just something to buy and sell. It's all about property values and what you can build on it or what resources you can take out of it. But what if we saw it differently? What if we saw it as something important to people's culture and their spirit?
That's a really important question to think about, especially now when it seems like everybody just wants to make money off the land.
Yeah.
What Tijerina did, it makes us rethink how we see the land. It makes us see how connected people are to the places they come from.
It makes you wonder if there's a way to include those ideas about culture and spirit into our laws and politics. Could that help make things more fair, not just for certain groups, but for everyone?
Those are some good questions. And I think Tijerina's story, even with all the complications and different opinions about it, I think it's a good place to start those conversations.
He was a guy who, well, he dared to imagine something different. A future where people respected the land, where they kept the promises they made in treaties, and where communities could, decide their own future. And even though that dream hasn't totally come true yet, his story, it keeps inspiring us. It makes us want to work for a world that's more just and fair.
It does. He reminds us that fighting for justice, it can be a long and hard road, but it's worth doing. And sometimes the strongest thing we have is our voice, our willingness to speak up even when it's hard and to say, we deserve better. Not just for ourselves, but for the people who come after us.
Well, this has been great. Exploring Tijerina's life and what he left behind, it's been a real journey. And I kind of hope this deep dive leaves you with more questions than answers, because that's how you know you're really learning something.
Keep asking those questions, keep learning, and keep fighting for a world where everyone has a right to land, to be treated with respect, and to have a future full of hope.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.